to understand the nature and the source of cognitive distortions, it's helpful to study the evolution of psychology, the advancements in the understanding of and the understanding and the treatment of cognitive distortions has been very fascinating, especially in the last half of the century. So psychology has its roots in mythology, ancient wisdom, and philosophy. The mythological stories of Lao Tzu and Aristotle and the Buddha and Socrates and Plato, they all had their basis in virtues, morality, and their strengths of character. All of the ancient philosophers knew the importance of thought or cognition in leading happy lives. Even though psychology dates back to the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Greece and India and Persia and China, psychology was considered philosophy or theory because it lacked scientific proof. So it wasn't until 1879 when Wilhelm Wundt first opened his psychology lab in Germany, and then many others followed. In his first lab, he mapped out some damaged areas in the brain, he named some mental illnesses, and this was the beginning of psychology as a science. We all know, we don't have to talk much about Sigmund Freud and his psychodynamic psychology or psychotherapy or talk therapy. It is still being practiced today. The next major development is behaviorism. Now, behaviorists believe that science should only be concerned with observable behavior. So they left out mental events and the mind completely from their theories. Next was the humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology is the American version of existentialism that existed in Europe in the late 1800s with the teachings of Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche and many, many others. Existentialism is a philosophy concerned with finding the self and the meaning of life through free will, personal responsibility, and free choice. So existentialism and Buddhism and humanists all believe that human lives are just full of suffering, but with personal choice, we can find a way to our happiness. The humanist approach was the precursor to positive psychology. While the behaviorism and the humanistic and existential approach was being debated and practiced, a high number of veterans were returning from World War II, showing signs of mental disturbance. A document called Medical 203 was published by psychiatrist and Brigadier General William C. Menninger. Now, Medical 203 was the first taxonomy or classification of mental diseases, and it was the basis of, now you can see it, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Mental Disorders, called the DSM, also called the Manual of the Insanities. Now, the first DSM was published in 1952, and it had 300 pages and about 106 disorders. We're now in its fourth revision. We have 1,000 pages and 297 disorders, all the way from Asperger's syndrome to voyeurism. I think I had a professor in college that had both, actually. The DSM took the mental illness out of insane asylums and made words like paranoia and schizophrenia and obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety. And it made household words, and the diagnosis and the treatment of mental illnesses flourished. Now, let's go back to the ranch to the history of psychology, or more specifically, the path to positive psychology. That's what we're trying to get to here. Another branch of psychology, cognitive psychology, began gaining popularity in the late 60s, and then the cognitive revolution took off after that. Unlike behaviorism, which only focused on observable behaviors, cognitive psychology focused on internal mental states. So it was concerned with how people perceive, remember, think, speak, and solve problems. So now the guys are on the right track, you know? Now they're going the right way. Evolution is always great, isn't it? So although the early behavioral approach was successful in treating certain neurotic disorders, it was not very successful in relieving depression. Now, Dr. Aaron Beck while conducting free association with patients in the classic Freudian psychoanalysis, he found that by changing his patients' cognitive distortions, their negative thinking patterns, he was actually relieving depression in his patients. Now this was huge. This was huge for him to realize this, because he noted that there was no empirical evidence that Freud's psychoanalysis was effective. As a matter of fact, he had patients in his practice for 20 years showing little or no signs of improvement. You and I probably know people who've been in psychotherapy for years with little or no signs of improvement. So this was a huge realization. Beck was finding that the ancient philosophers were correct and that our happiness is directly linked to how we think. And as Buddha said in this lovely little quote, all that we are is the result of what we have thought. Isn't that beautiful? I love that quote. So, continuing the work of Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, Dr. David D. Burns published a book in 1980 called Feeling Good, and this is the book that identified the 10 most common cognitive distortions, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later. Now, Aaron Beck, who is considered the father of cognitive psychology, not only influenced Dr. Burns, but he also influenced Dr. Martin Seligman, who is the founder of the positive psychology movement. Now, Dr. Beck and Seligman and Dr. Burns, they were all at the University of Pennsylvania Psychology Department, where Dr. Beck really helped Dr. Martin Seligman's cognitive studies. But it was a little bit over a decade ago when Martin Seligman made the statement that psychology is more than half-baked. Just like my cookies on the slide here, psychology is a little bit more than half-baked, he said. What he meant was there was too much concentration on mental illness and not enough on mental wellness. So, did you know, this is a really important, nobody knows this, but the ratio of psychology research is 21 negative to 1 positive. So, he's way more than half-baked, right? So Martin Seligman and his positive psychologists are interested in what traits that flourishing, happy people have in common. And can those traits be taught to others? Now, this may not sound like a huge, giant leap for mankind, but it really is. Whoa, that'll wake you guys up. You guys look like you were getting a little bored there. So, positive psychology, as you know, our understanding of human flourishing originally came from mythology, ancient wisdom, and philosophy, right? Now, you also know now, as I told you, that humanistic psychology was the precursor to positive psychology. But positive psychology is the first branch of science that applied scientific and empirical research to this whole concept of human flourishing.